I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because loving you started to feel like drowning. Every time you got close, it felt like I was being seen without armor. And that terrified me. Not because you were dangerous, but because you were safe. And I didn't know what to do with that. You gave me consistency, presence, love, things I never truly believed I deserved. So I pushed you away, told myself lies like you'll be better off without me, or this isn't what I want. But the truth is, I wanted you more than anything. I just didn't know how to let you in without falling apart. Every time you reached for me, I felt exposed. Like you were getting too close to the parts of me I've spent years trying to hide. The fear, the shame, the belief that I'm not enough. And instead of facing those wounds, I ran. I left because staying meant healing, and healing meant changing. And change terrified me more than losing you. But please know, I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to love you without losing myself in the process. And I'm sorry I made you feel like it was your fault.
The most heartbreaking aspect of loving an avoidant is discovering that they can genuinely love someone deeply while simultaneously feeling compelled to leave them. This paradox defies conventional understanding of love and relationships, where caring for someone typically motivates staying and working through challenges together. For avoidants, however, love itself becomes the very reason they must escape, creating tragic scenarios where the depth of their feelings drives them away from the person they love most. Understanding this contradiction requires examining the complex psychological mechanisms that make love feel threatening rather than secure to the avoidant mind. The avoidant's decision to leave, despite being in love, stems from their fundamental belief that love equals vulnerability, vulnerability equals danger, and staying in love guarantees eventual devastation. Their attachment system has been conditioned to interpret deep emotional connection as a threat to their psychological survival, rather than enhancement of their life experience. When they recognize how much someone means to them, it triggers every defensive alarm they've developed to protect themselves from emotional harm. This tragic pattern reveals the sophisticated psychological defense system that has organized itself around preventing the very experiences that could heal their attachment wounds. The avoidant leaves, not because they don't love enough, but because they love too much for their defensive structure to tolerate. Their departure represents the ultimate victory of fear over love, protection over growth, familiar pain over unfamiliar joy. Understanding this dynamic provides crucial insight into why relationships with avoidants often end precisely when they seem to be deepening and improving. The terror of emotional dependence. When avoidants recognize that they genuinely love someone, they simultaneously recognize that they've become emotionally dependent on that person's presence, approval, and continued affection. This dependence feels like a fundamental threat to their identity and psychological safety, because their entire sense of self has been built around emotional independence and self-sufficiency. The realization that another person has become essential to their happiness triggers existential terror about loss of autonomy and control. The avoidant begins to notice how much they look forward to their partner's presence, how their mood improves when they receive affection, and how their daily decisions increasingly consider their partner's preferences and needs. These signs of healthy interdependence feel like warning signals of dangerous attachment that must be severed before it becomes too strong to escape. They interpret normal relationship bonding as evidence that they're losing themselves and becoming vulnerable to devastating loss. This terror intensifies when the avoidant recognizes that their partner has gained the power to hurt them deeply through withdrawal of love, criticism, or abandonment. Having spent years protecting themselves from emotional pain through distance and independence, they suddenly find themselves exposed to potential suffering that feels unbearable to contemplate. The love that should feel like security instead feels like handing someone a weapon that could destroy them. The avoidant also fears that emotional dependence will reveal their neediness and inadequacy to their partner, contradicting the strong, independent image they've carefully constructed. They worry that showing how much they need and want their partner will create disappointment or disgust that leads to rejection. This fear of being seen as emotionally dependent motivates them to leave before their vulnerability becomes too obvious or overwhelming. The dependence terror is compounded by their belief that all relationships eventually end, meaning that any emotional investment will ultimately result in loss and pain. They reason that leaving, while they still have some emotional control, is preferable to staying and risking complete devastation when the inevitable abandonment occurs. This preemptive strike protects them from the deeper pain they believe is coming, the suffocation of intimacy. As relationships deepen and intimacy increases, avoidants often experience a psychological suffocation that makes staying feel impossible despite their love for their partner. This suffocation isn't caused by their partner's behavior, but by their own internal response to increasing emotional closeness that triggers claustrophobic feelings about loss of self and autonomy. The very intimacy they crave becomes the reason they must escape. The avoidant begins to feel like they're losing their individual identity as the relationship becomes more central to their life and self-concept. They notice themselves thinking in terms of we instead of I, making decisions based on their partner's needs rather than just their own, and finding their happiness increasingly tied to their partner's emotional state. This normal relationship evolution feels like personality dissolution that threatens their core sense of self. The suffocation intensifies when the avoidant realizes they can no longer imagine their life without their partner, that this person has become so integrated into their daily existence and future planning that separation would require rebuilding their entire life structure. This recognition of how embedded their partner has become in their world triggers panic about being trapped in a situation they can't easily escape if needed. Physical intimacy also contributes to the suffocation, as the avoidant notices how much they crave their partner's touch, presence, and sexual connection. This physical need feels like another form of dependence that compromises their self-sufficiency and creates vulnerability they're not prepared to handle. They may begin to feel like their body is betraying their emotional independence through its obvious desire for continued connection. The avoidant experiences the relationship as taking up too much mental and emotional space, leaving insufficient room for their individual thoughts, goals, and identity. They feel like they're being consumed by the connection rather than enhanced by it, leading to desperation for space and freedom that can only be achieved through ending the relationship entirely. The fear of inevitable abandonment. Despite being in love, avoidants often leave because they believe abandonment is inevitable and prefer to control the timing and circumstances of the relationship's end rather than waiting to be left by their partner. Their attachment history has taught them that people always leave eventually, and they've learned that taking preemptive action provides some psychological protection from the devastating surprise of unexpected abandonment. This fear is often triggered when the relationship becomes more serious or committed, as the avoidant anticipates that increased expectations and responsibilities will eventually reveal their inadequacies and cause their partner to lose interest. They believe that their emotional limitations, communication difficulties, and relationship struggles will ultimately drive their partner away, making departure feel inevitable rather than optional. The avoidant may interpret normal relationship challenges, conflicts, or periods of distance as evidence that their partner is beginning to lose interest and plan their exit. They catastrophize minor disagreements into relationship-ending problems and view their partner's occasional frustrations as proof that abandonment is imminent. This hypervigilance for rejection signs creates self-fulfilling prophecies where their fear-based behavior actually causes the abandonment they're trying to avoid. They also fear that their partner will eventually meet someone more emotionally available, communicative, or relationship ready, and realize they've been settling for less than they deserve. This comparison anxiety makes the avoidant feel like they're living on borrowed time, waiting for their partner to discover their inadequacies and upgrade to a better relationship option. The fear of abandonment creates a psychological timeline where the avoidant feels pressure to leave before being left, viewing their departure as protection from greater future pain. They reason that ending things while they still have some control is preferable to being devastated by unexpected rejection when they're more emotionally invested and vulnerable. The inability to tolerate their own vulnerability. When avoidants fall in love, they often experience levels of vulnerability that feel unbearable and dangerous to their psychological equilibrium. The emotional openness required for deep love contradicts everything they've learned about staying safe in relationships, creating internal conflict between their authentic feelings and their defensive strategies. This vulnerability feels like weakness that must be eliminated rather than strength that enhances their life. The avoidant may find themselves sharing thoughts, feelings, and experiences they've never revealed to anyone else, creating terror about being truly known and potentially judged or rejected for their authentic self. This emotional exposure feels like psychological nakedness that leaves them defenseless against potential criticism, disappointment, or abandonment from someone who now knows their deepest truths. They struggle with the unpredictability of their own emotions when in love, feeling out of control of their internal experience in ways that contradict their need for emotional regulation and stability. The intensity of their feelings for their partner feels overwhelming and frightening, like losing control of their emotional thermostat that has always kept them safe from being hurt by others. The vulnerability also includes recognizing how much power their partner has gained over their emotional state and overall happiness. The avoidant realizes that their partner's moods, decisions, and treatment of them significantly impacts their own well-being in ways they can't control or manage through their usual defensive strategies. This loss of emotional autonomy feels like a dangerous surrender of self-protection. Their inability to tolerate vulnerability often manifests as shame about their own emotional needs and desires within the relationship. They feel weak for wanting their partner's attention, needing their approval, or being affected by their behavior. This shame about natural human needs for connection and love motivates them to leave before their neediness becomes more obvious or overwhelming. The overwhelm of responsibility. Being in love creates relationship responsibilities that can feel overwhelming to avoidants who have organized their lives around minimal obligation to others' emotional needs and well-being. The recognition that their partner needs and deserves consistent emotional availability, communication, and consideration creates pressure that feels unbearable to someone whose coping strategies revolve around independence and self-focus. The avoidant realizes that maintaining a loving relationship requires ongoing emotional labor, including regular communication about feelings, participation in conflict resolution, consideration of their partner's needs in decision-making, and consistent emotional support during their partner's difficult periods. These expectations feel like constant demands that compromise their autonomy and require energy they don't feel capable of providing sustainably. They become overwhelmed by the complexity of managing another person's emotions while trying to regulate their own psychological state. The avoidant worries about saying or doing the wrong thing, hurting their partner's feelings through their emotional limitations, or failing to provide the level of support and understanding their partner deserves. This performance anxiety about relationship responsibilities creates stress that makes staying feel impossible. The responsibility overwhelm includes fear about their capacity to meet their partner's long-term needs for emotional growth, life partnership, and mutual support through various life challenges. The avoidant doubts their ability to be the kind of partner their loved one deserves over time and decides that leaving is kinder than staying, and inevitably disappointing someone they care about deeply. They also feel overwhelmed by the expectation to work through their own attachment issues and emotional limitations for the benefit of the relationship. The pressure to change, grow, and develop greater emotional capacity feels like being asked to become a fundamentally different person, which triggers their fear of losing their authentic self in favor of who they think they should be for love. The familiar comfort of isolation. Despite loving someone deeply, avoidants often choose to leave because isolation and emotional independence feel more familiar and therefore safer than the unknown territory of sustained intimate connection. Their nervous system has adapted to the rhythms of solitude, self-reliance, and emotional distance that make these states feel like home, even when they're ultimately unfulfilling. The avoidant may recognize that they function better emotionally when they don't have to consider another person's needs, manage relationship dynamics, or navigate the complexity of intimate connection. The simplicity of independent living feels more manageable than the ongoing negotiation and emotional availability required for healthy relationships, even when they genuinely love their partner. Isolation provides predictability and control that intimate relationships cannot offer. The avoidant knows how to manage their emotional state when alone, how to structure their time and energy for maximum comfort, and how to avoid the unpredictable demands and challenges that come with being deeply connected to another person. This familiarity feels safer than the unknown challenges of sustained love. They may also feel more competent and confident when operating independently rather than navigating the vulnerabilities and uncertainties of intimate partnership. The avoidant's self-esteem may be higher when they don't have to face their relationship limitations or work through emotional challenges that feel overwhelming and insurmountable. The comfort of isolation includes freedom from judgment, expectations, and the emotional labor required to maintain connection with someone who knows them intimately. While this independence ultimately leads to loneliness and regret, the immediate relief of escaping relationship pressures can feel more appealing than continuing to struggle with the demands of love. The self-sabotage protection mechanism. Leaving despite being in love often represents the avoidant's unconscious attempt to protect themselves from future pain by creating it in the present on their own terms. This self-sabotage allows them to maintain some sense of control over their suffering, while avoiding the risk of being blindsided by unexpected loss or rejection from their partner. The avoidant reasons that if they're going to experience the pain of losing this person anyway, it's better to create that loss themselves, rather than waiting for it to happen through their partner's choice or external circumstances. This preemptive strike provides the illusion of control over their emotional experience, while ensuring they don't become even more attached and vulnerable before the inevitable separation occurs. Self-sabotage also allows the avoidant to maintain their narrative about relationships being temporary and dangerous, rather than having to confront evidence that lasting love might be possible with the right person. By ending things themselves, they can preserve their defensive beliefs, rather than risking the vulnerability required to discover whether their fears about relationships are actually accurate. The protection mechanism includes avoiding the possibility of deeper attachment that would make eventual loss even more devastating. The avoidant calculates that leaving now, while they have some emotional reserves, is preferable to staying and risking complete emotional destruction if the relationship fails later when they're more invested and dependent. This self-sabotage often occurs precisely when the relationship is going well and the avoidant is happiest, because these positive experiences feel too good to be true and trigger their expectation that disappointment is imminent. Rather than enjoying the good times while they last, they end things proactively to avoid the crash they believe is coming. The tragic irony of protective love. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of why avoidants leave, despite being in love, is their distorted belief that leaving protects their partner from their own emotional limitations and inevitable relationship failures. They convince themselves that their partner deserves someone more emotionally available and relationally capable, making their departure feel like an act of love rather than abandonment. This protective narrative allows the avoidant to frame their leaving as selfless sacrifice rather than selfish self-protection. They tell themselves they're setting their partner free to find someone who can love them properly, meet their emotional needs consistently, and provide the kind of relationship security and stability they believe they cannot offer. The avoidant may also believe that their presence in their partner's life is harmful or limiting, that their emotional unavailability and defensive behaviors are preventing their partner from healing, growing, or finding genuine happiness. This distorted thinking transforms their departure into perceived kindness, rather than recognizing it as the very behavior that causes the most harm to someone who loves them. The protective love narrative prevents the avoidant from recognizing that their partner chose them despite their limitations, that love includes accepting imperfection, and that working through challenges together could provide healing and growth for both people. Instead, they make unilateral decisions about what's best for their partner without allowing that person to participate in determining their own needs and preferences. This tragic irony means that the avoidant's deepest expressions of love often manifest as abandonment of the very person they're trying to protect, creating exactly the kind of pain and rejection they claim to want to prevent. Their attempt to love, through leaving, becomes the most unloving thing they could do to someone who has invested their heart in the relationship. Understanding why avoidants leave, despite being in love, reveals the profound cost of unhealed attachment wounds and the tragic way that defensive strategies designed to prevent pain often create the very suffering they're meant to avoid. This awareness can provide compassion for the avoidant's internal struggle, while highlighting the importance of addressing attachment issues before they destroy the very relationships that could provide healing and genuine happiness.